This podcast contains descriptions of death and violence that some listeners may find upsetting.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the 6 o'clock knock. I'm Simon Ford, and as ever I'm joined by former major crime detective Jack Morrell. And today we are looking at foot fetishes and fingerprints. Yep, that's right, you heard it here first. Foot fetishes and fingerprints. Now, in my copy of the Chambers Student Dictionary from the 1970s, which dates me a little bit, a fetish is defined only by it being an object that is regarded with irrational reverence, a spiritual charm, in fact. It derives from the Portuguese word for magic. Did you know that? I'd no idea. Well done, the Chambers Student Dictionary. Of course, we now associate the word with sexuality, and fetish is defined as an abnormal sexual desire linked to a particular object.
So, the early definition related to a talisman then. I guess the key words from what you've just said there are irrational and abnormal. I know this is speaking from a police angle.
Yeah, that's pretty much the size of it. Now, we'll be looking at one particular case in detail, and then we're going to refer to a couple of other cases that have a foot or a shoe fetish angle to them. Now, I don't advise anybody to go on the internet looking for this stuff because it can make for a very peculiar browsing history, even in the interests of research. To start with, our main case is a dreadful murder from 1994, but it wasn't solved for 6 years when a breakthrough came from a fingerprint at the scene. And in fact, I must declare an interest. I was a reporter at the time in West Yorkshire, and I covered this case. So before we look at it in detail, Jack, did you have any interesting cases solved due to fingerprints yourself?
I remember one in particular from about 1990. And I remember it because I actually got a call from the fingerprint expert. He was actually excited about it and he wanted to tell me in person. Now, it sounds a little bit odd, and it was unusual in itself. It's worth reminding, really, I suppose, and for the listeners' benefit, that an automated fingerprint system was not introduced until, I think, the late 1990s.
Wow, as late as that? A computerised one, yeah? Because that's something, it's a mainstay of every detective television program, isn't it? Every whodunit is the fingerprint. So, yeah, not until the late 1990s.
Yeah, the automated system wasn't till then. Prior to that, fingerprints were dealt with manually and in a very methodical process. There was a series of documents going backwards and forwards in the internal mail. First, you would receive a form from the Bureau about fingerprints, known as marks, that related to your case. You would then eliminate any people who may innocently have left their fingerprint, and then you would consider any potential suspects. You would submit a form asking the fingerprint officer to compare the mark with the fingerprints, and it was only rare, thinking back, that officers would actually visit the fingerprint bureau. Now, I was working on a series of crimes that involved, it was the issuing of stolen cheques. It was all very organised, and we were under pressure to stop it. I was working in a small inner city CRD office when the phone rang, and it was this fingerprint officer called Bill. Now, he'd rung me to tell me that he'd identified fingerprints on some of the stolen cheques. He invited me over, and I remember it now. I was fascinated by what he said. He'd been processing one of the stolen cheques, and he recognised a thumbprint on it. He had recognised the thumbprint. And incredibly, he knew he'd seen it before and recently. And he said there was a distinctive pattern in it. Now, bear in mind that Bill and his team spent all day looking at fingerprints. Not only did he remember he'd seen the mark before, he knew it was from a person who'd recently been detained for the first time.
That is astonishing. Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I should add that each mark is graded as to its evidential value. And the best grading is, we used to use the term GEFC, good enough for court. And that means that the fingerprint could convict a person who left it at the scene.
So I take it that the call from Bill in the Fingerprint Bureau was a good enough for court?
Yes, it was. The call from Bill was a very lucky breakthrough. It was a series of stolen cheque frauds, and it was part of a racket that was causing us a real headache. We were being run ragged by a spate of crimes. It involved thefts of handbags and then wholesale fraud, where the cheques were issued to the maximum possible value.
Oh, interesting. So what's going on then, Jack?
Right, there was a stretch of road that ran along the side of a small housing estate, and in the morning rush hour, the traffic ground to a halt. That was the time for the local youths to strike, and they preyed on women in cars who, more importantly, were also alone. Now, before these women realised what had happened, the passenger door of their car was open, and their handbag, which had been on the passenger seat, was now in the hands of a youth running back into the estate.
Wow, right, so like a snake lying in wait under a rock and then striking out at its prey and disappearing again. I'm over-dramatising that. It must have been really traumatic for the victims.
By the time the Radio 1 jingle had finished on the poor woman's car stereo, this youth was back into the estate. The whole operation was that quick, because by the time these women had got to their place of work and called the police, this is obviously pre-mobile phones, someone was touring the supermarkets in the area, writing out cheques like they were going out of fashion.
Oh, right, okay. So this would be the equivalent nowadays of taking somebody's card and just making a whole bunch of contactless transactions.
Yes, exactly. They were buying all the essentials, as you can imagine, cigarettes, alcohol. It was a well-organised operation, and we were getting run ragged, and we were struggling to stop it. Now, what was unusual in Bill's fingerprint discovery was that the suspect he had identified was a man. Now, bear in mind, all these cheques, they all belonged to women.
So they're looking for, what, a guy wearing a wig or something? It makes you wonder, really, doesn't it? Okay, what was happening then?
The suspect was a young man who had recently been arrested and cautioned for a relatively minor offence. I think it was a domestic-related issue. And he was from a completely different part of town as well. His involvement just didn't fit in with the usual activity that was going off.
Oh, right. So this chap got the dreaded 6 o'clock knock, did he?
He did. And as soon as we had him in, it was clear that he was a little bit out of his depth. He also did the right thing. He told the truth. Now, he revealed how these crimes were being organised, and more importantly, by who. Now, this young man's girlfriend had moved into the area where the racket was being organised, and she'd been pressured and bullied into getting involved with this cheque fraud. The chequebook that she had been given and told to use had one of those unisex names, and thinking back, I think it was Leslie or something like that.
Oh, okay, or Vivian or something. So the spelling might vary between the genders, but actually for somebody in a shop who's just taking a check, they're not going to check that closely. Check that closely. Apologies.
Correct. Now, this young man had done the honourable thing, and he got his girlfriend out of the dilemma, and he went to commit the frauds himself. So we were now ready to give the ringleaders the 6 o'clock knock, and it had all started with that brilliant piece of work by our fingerprint expert Bill. Otherwise, we would have been struggling.
That is fascinating. And Bill recognised this by eye. His life was fingerprints, yeah? Incredible. Nowadays, of course, police forces can search a computer database to see if fingerprints match those of a known criminal. They don't need Bill. Maybe that's the code name they give the computer. Wouldn't it be great if they did? Oh no, it's called the National Automated Fingerprints Identification System, or NAFIS for short. And it's able to compare millions of prints from all over the UK and find a match within minutes. As you explained, Jack, NAFIS was gradually introduced to UK forces between 1997 and 2001. Prior to that, forces were only able to search their own paper records, which related to criminals from their own local area.
That's exactly right. The only other way we would have been able to identify this young man would have been if someone had told us what he'd been up to. It's as simple as that. Then we would have asked the Fingerprint Bureau to do the comparison. Otherwise, without that, it was a needle in a haystack.
And I guess with the stolen cheque case, there were hundreds of them and producing lots and lots of fingerprints.
Yes, you can imagine the work involved. The bank would receive them through the clearing system. They would retain them as a batch, send them to their own fraud department, and then they would be sent on to the police. The police would then assess the urgency of it before submitting the cheques to a chemical treatment that reveals any fingerprint marks. These would be assessed as a batch. If the mark was repeated, it would suggest that it was the suspects. Now, bear in mind that most of these cheque kiters, as we called them, were careful not to leave their fingerprints behind.
So wearing gloves and what have you, that kind of thing, or handling them with a tissue or something. Okay, well, great, interesting stuff, mate. Let's move on to our first case now, our first murder case, which is known as the shoe fetish killing, and the perpetrator of that, the shoe fetish killer. Now, this is an appalling crime that occurred in Wakefield, which is in West Yorkshire, Northern England, in March 1994, and it concerns the murder of a woman called Wendy Speaks. It is indeed a truly awful crime, and I should warn you that if you're of a sensitive disposition, you might just want to brace yourself for this. There's a useful documentary by CBS Reality that has interviews with Wendy's daughter and the senior detectives. You might want to look that up. And some of you will know about the Yorkshire Ripper case from the 1970s. The pressure on West Yorkshire CID to detect this one must have been enormous. It took years to find the killer, and as with most cases, this needed a bit of luck in the end.
That's right. I think it's worth adding as well at this point that whilst this case is only, 25 years old, I suggest that there's now more ways for the police to get those important names of people to consider, those people they need to eliminate from the investigation. And we can touch on that later.
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, I was a reporter involved in covering the early stages of this case. I'd moved on before an arrest was made, actually. I was doing another job at the time. But Wendy Speaks was 51 years old, and she lived in an end terrace house on the outskirts of Wakefield. She'd got 2 grown-up daughters, and they'd moved away from home. She lived alone, Wendy, and worked as a receptionist. And she was described by everybody who knew her as pleasant, friendly, contented. One morning, Wendy didn't turn up for work. Now, this was unusual for Wendy because she was very reliable, so her colleagues tried phoning her at home. There was no reply, so they phoned her daughter, Tracy. Tracy lived in another part of the country, but had a close relationship with her mum and was in regular contact with her. And Tracy knew something was wrong immediately. She asked her cousin, who lived nearby, to check on the house. Her cousin found the front door unlocked, and this, another unusual occurrence. Wendy only used to leave the back door open to access the house. Having stepped inside, she called out for Wendy. No reply. The cousin then saw that all of Wendy's shoes had been taken from the cupboard and strewn over the kitchen floor. Now, sensing something was wrong, she came away and called the police, and it was perhaps a really good job that she did. A police officer found Wendy. She was at the foot of her bed. She was obviously dead, knife wounds to her back. She was clothed in what she'd worn to work the day before, but her underwear had been removed. She'd been raped, then she'd been stabbed multiple times to the back and to the neck. The fact that the first knife wound was enough to render her unconscious was, in the fullness of time, a small comfort to her daughter, knowing that Wendy just knew nothing of the sustained assault that she underwent. Now, West Yorkshire CID had a murder inquiry that, from the outset, was likely to require lots of resources. They had no obvious motive other than sexual. Even more concerning, they had no suspect. There was nothing in Wendy's lifestyle that was of concern, and the scene suggested she didn't know her killer. The scene itself was all they had to go on. It needed a systematic examination.
Now, in addition to the shoes that were strewn around the house, a pair of Wendy's heeled shoes had been placed on her bedside cabinet. And this was odd, and according to her daughter, definitely not something Wendy would have done. Even more odd was that Wendy was wearing a pair of shoes that weren't hers, a pair of tatty blue mules. Wendy had also been tied up with black stockings that were not hers, and the knife used to attack her had not been left at the scene. The forensic examination of the scene was painstaking and took place over a couple of days. Eventually, this small terraced house where Wendy had raised her children revealed some crucial evidence. And this was found in the area of the front door, which opened out onto the pavement and was visible to any passers-by. There was a small smear of blood on the door frame. Also, on the inside of the metal lever of the door handle was a fingerprint. Not a complete fingerprint, but a partial mark. Of even more significance was both the blood and the fingerprint were not Wendy's, and nor were they from an innocent visitor to the house. The problem was that the police did not have a match, and they still did not have that suspect.
Right. Well, within a few days, a couple of key witnesses came forward. There was a witness who'd been working near to Wendy's house that evening. He described seeing a man speaking to a woman on the doorstep of her house, and the man was later seen leaving the property. The police also traced a woman living in another part of Wakefield. Now, she'd answered a door to a man earlier on in the afternoon of Wendy's murder. That man was asking directions. He'd been kept on the doorstep, and despite asking to use the phone at one point, remember, mobiles weren't as widespread as they are now, the man wasn't allowed to go into the house to use the house phone. Now, the description from both these witnesses was of a white man in his 30s, about 5'6" tall and balding. Various press appeals were made, but no significant leads came from it. The detectives then considered the issue with the shoes. There was sufficient evidence to suggest that the killer had a shoe fetish. After incapacitating Wendy, gagging her and binding her wrists, he must have left her on the bed and then gone downstairs and searched through her shoes, selecting a pair which he then placed on view of the bed where the rape took place. He'd also put a pair of shoes on her feet. Shoes that he'd brought with him and which the police believed were probably brought from a charity shop. Now, there was something about women's shoes that sexually aroused this guy. This was highly significant. Although not a crime in itself, this odd fetish was important to the killer. But who were these people, and how many of them are there in society? Shoe fetishists. In order to try and find out, the police placed a surreptitious advert in the local paper. It gave a phone number and invited people with a shoe fetish to make contact. Interestingly, some people did, although they didn't get to satisfy their fetish, as they were promptly invited to the police station in order to eliminate them from the investigation.
Yeah, and again, the suspect has not yet been identified. Now, with investigations of this magnitude, you can imagine that there was not one day when there was no police activity to find the killer of Wendy Speaks. Despite the best efforts of the police, the suspect was still some way off. How would they get the name of the killer? Who would suggest the right name? Surely someone must have their suspicions. West Yorkshire Fingerprint Bureau had been tasked with conducting a review every month. As I mentioned earlier, prior to the introduction of the automated system NAFIS, this would have been conducted manually by a fingerprint officer, looking at the individual fingerprints taken from people in West Yorkshire. The officer would then compare these fingerprints to the mark found on the handle of the door. There would be hundreds of sets of fingerprints arriving each month, so this process could be, say, a day's work in itself. The fingerprint officer would carefully look at every document under a magnifying glass. Now, these monthly reviews continued. even with the introduction of NAFIS, and because the crime scene mark was only a partial fingerprint, this monthly check needed some human input. The fingerprint officer needed to retrieve the crime scene mark and to select 10 points or features on it for the computer to compare it to. These 10 points are open to human interpretation whilst following the procedures.
So, Jack, is there anything in the report about what part of the hand the mark on the door handle came from?
No, that's not mentioned, although the fingerprint officer would have a reasonable idea from interpreting the location of it. They would have an idea which hand and which finger it came from. I suppose if you imagine an individual fingerprint as a face in a photograph, you're comparing it to someone who looks very similar. You may select a number of features for comparison, the distance from eye to eye, nose to mouth, earlobe to middle of jaw, location of a birthmark, that kind of thing. Just as everyone's face is different, so is a fingerprint. The different lines on the fingerprints are given terms linked to rivers or contours on a map. Terms such as delta, spur, island, bridge, valley, etc. It's the combination of these features in different places that make the fingerprint unique. Now, the advantage of NAFIS was that after the manual selection of the features to compare, the system would search the records quickly. If it identified a possible match, then the fingerprint expert would need to check it more thoroughly. And this monthly search of NAFIS database continued. And after about 5 years of this vitally important routine, the day came when the fingerprint officer selected the 10 features, entered them into NAFIS. On this occasion, the computer suggested a match. The fingerprint record of a man named Christopher Farrow. The fingerprint officer made a double check by looking at them again. They now had a significant person of interest. Now, Farrow had been arrested in Bradford in 1996, and a quick check on his record gave that all-important corroboration that supported those two witnesses that we mentioned earlier. Farrow was a white man, 33 years of age, around 5'6" tall and balding, just as the witnesses had described the man in Wakefield 2 years before.
So, just let me check, have I got this right, Jack? Both the murder and Farrow's arrest took place in the same county in West Yorkshire. This means that the fingerprint from the murder scene and Farrow's fingerprints were held in the same bureau, but because it was a partial fingerprint, the checks had to be run manually every month, yeah? This required an individual process each time, selecting certain points or features, as you call them. I mean, we'd say biometrics now, wouldn't we, from the mark found on the door handle. It still relied on an element of luck, almost, for it to show up on the search. And that search was manual, was it? That was somebody with a magnifying glass, Sherlock Holmes style.
Yes, you've got it right, Simon.
And as I understand it, Farrow's arrest had an element of good fortune to it as well, didn't it?
Yes, you could say that, coupled with some diligent police work. Now, Farrow had been drinking in a pub in Bradford, and he was boasting about the fact that he was drinking and driving. Now, the problem for him on that day was that he happened to be boasting to an off-duty police officer, and she wasn't very impressed. She managed to alert her colleagues and arrange for a traffic stop of him as he drove away from the pub.
Wow, loose lips sink ships and all that. So Bradford's boasting boozer was facing his first visit to a police station then. So, Jack, can you give us any context with how Farrow was identified?
As people are probably appreciating here, the problem was that up to then there was nothing to connect Farrow to the case in any way. It needed that vital piece of information that the police would ask the public for. It needed someone to suggest the name Christopher Farrow, and it took a diligent fingerprint officer to suggest the name. The media appeals, the description by the witnesses, the shoe fetish angle, none of this information had prompted someone to call in with their concerns about Christopher Farrow. And we can assume that there was little intelligence on this man. We can assume that he'd not come to the notice of the murder investigation. And it's also a shame that no one reported their concerns about Farrow's sexual fetish or his unusual behaviour towards women. And it reminds us, doesn't it, that even in a murder investigation of this significance, the police don't always get that important phone call.
Yeah, indeed. We've seen that a few times, haven't we? But the good news was they had a suspect in custody, and after his blood sample was whisked off to the lab, they soon had DNA confirmation that it was Farrow's blood that had been smeared on the doorframe of Wendy Speak's house, Bourne Lane in Wakefield.
Yes, indeed. And it's perhaps worth mentioning the situation with DNA at that time, Simon. Now, in the late 1990s, DNA had arrived, but it was in the early stages of being used. Farrow's blood was taken as an intimate sample in relation to the offence for which he'd been arrested. And this was before there was a national database. And I think at the time DNA was routinely taken from convicted people in custody. The law then gradually changed to allow the police to take DNA from people when they were charged. And it was a few years later that the law changed again and DNA was taken on arrest.
So this period in the late 1990s was essentially a massive leap forward in police investigations, wasn't it?
Spot on, Simon, yeah. An automated fingerprint system and then the irrefutable evidence of DNA was an absolute game changer without a shadow of a doubt.
Wow. OK, so now it's November 2000. Over 6 years after the murder of Wendy Speaks, Christopher Farrow pleads guilty to her rape and murder. Farrow also admitted the attempted burglary of the other woman's house with intent to rape her less than an hour earlier. This is the woman who told him he couldn't come in and use the phone. Robert Smith QC, prosecuting, said, "The footwear, like the black shoe on the bedside table, was intended to play some specific role for the purposes of sexual arousal, as did the stockings." Mr. Smith added, "Farrow liked to look at shoes when he was having sex." The prosecutor said that Farrow had told detectives, "I just saw her," this is Wendy Speaks, "get off a bus, and I was getting off another bus. I'd been thinking how crap my life was. My sex life was absolute zero. I had a lot of upset and anger towards my girlfriend. I decided to do something that day to someone. I just wanted someone to suffer the same way as I was feeling." The prosecution also included a statement from Farrow's first wife, who revealed that he used to insist that she wore stiletto shoes when she did the garden. Farrow was ordered to serve a minimum of 18 years in prison. The judge added that he would recommend Farrow remain in custody for very, very many years. Despite this, Christopher Farrow was allowed a parole board hearing in 2019. At the hearing, the panel heard oral evidence from Mr. Farrow's offender manager, offender supervisor, and 2 psychologists. In relation to Farrow's future risk to the public, the summary states, "The panel listed risk factors associated with Mr. Farrow, including the premeditated nature of the offences, relationship difficulties, his lifestyle and associates, alcohol misuse, a lack of emotional well-being, problems with his thinking and behaviour and attitudes." The panel noted that there were still areas of the offence which Mr. Farrow considered to either misrepresent, obfuscate or deny. The panel considered the release plan provided by the offender manager was not robust enough to manage Mr. Farrow in the community, and that he needed to progress through an open prison to help test him for future release and allow him more gradual exposure to being in the community while still having the constraints and supervision of being in prison. Witnesses were in a common agreement that this was a safe course of action to take. The panel was not satisfied that Farrow was suitable for release, but recommended he be transferred to an open prison. Farrow is now being held, indeed, in an open prison and may be eligible for release again.
A truly awful case, isn't it? We go back to our regular theme, don't we, of what causes people like Pharaoh to rape and kill in these circumstances, and then to stop. How much was his unhealthy obsession with women's shoes a factor? He doesn't appear to have offended again between 94 and his arrest in 2000. But that said, surely he had the potential to offend again if released.
And thinking about it, Wendy Speaks was pure bad luck that Pharaoh targeted her because he just wanted to hurt somebody on that particular day, and she really was in the wrong place at the wrong time. How absolutely dreadful. And also, I suppose, for everybody else in Wakefield who was walking around, and Bradford, and I guess Leeds as well, all cities in West Yorkshire, walking around, and in their midst for those 6 years was the killer of Wendy Speaks, undetected, until he was finally collared and brought to book. So this shoe or foot fetish aspect, how prevalent is this in society? Well, you don't have to look far to see many cases over the years. These range from serial killers to what gets termed a public nuisance. Here's a well-recorded case in the United States. Jerry Brudos was an American serial killer who committed the murders of at least 4 women in Oregon between 1968 and 1969. As a child, his mother had wanted a girl and subjected him to emotional and physical abuse. Brudos developed a fetish for women's shoes from the age of 5 after playing with stiletto heels at a local junkyard. He reportedly attempted to steal the shoes of his first-grade teacher. He spent his teenage years in and out of psychotherapy and psychiatric hospitals. And during this time, he began to stalk women, knocking them down or choking them unconscious, and then fleeing with their shoes. At the age of 17, he abducted and beat a young woman, threatening to stab her if she didn't follow his sexual demands. In 1961, Brudos married a 17-year-old girl and settled in a Salem suburb. He asked his new bride to do housework naked, apart from a pair of high heels, while he took pictures. It was about this time that he began complaining of migraine headaches and blackouts, relieving his symptoms with night prowling raids to steal shoes and lacy undergarments. Brudos would experience a transgender period where he used the female persona as a form of escape mechanism. Brudos kept the shoes, underwear, and for a time the bodies of his victims in his garage. Between 1968 and 1969, Brudos bludgeoned and strangled 4 young women and attempted to attack 2 others. And there's another recent case in Yorkshire again, in England, less serious but still worrying and disturbing. It involved a young man with a foot fetish rather than a shoe fetish. Luke Merry, who was 25, was jailed for 18 months after pleading guilty to 2 offences of sexual assault of a child under 13 and 1 of voyeurism. Now, voyeurism, is that significant?
Did you know, Simon, that voyeurism is something that Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was known for prior to the murders that he went on to commit?
Was it? Now, that is interesting, and we all know how his behaviour escalated. As I said earlier, I spent some considerable time in West Yorkshire, and the scars that the Yorkshire Ripper case left took many, many years to heal, and in some cases I don't think they will ever heal. Well, in the Luke Merry case, it was described how Merry had touched the girls as they watched the film Dumbo with their parents at the cinema. One of the girls told her mother that she felt a hairy arm against the back of her calf and feared she was going to be pulled under the seat. The second girl jumped onto her chair after feeling a hand against her leg. The mother looked under the seat, saw a flashing light and a bony hand. Merry was found on the floor when the lights were turned on by cinema staff. This is terrible, isn't it? Take your kids to the cinema and you've got this guy crawling around under the seats. Blimey. He admitted the offences but claimed he believed that he'd been touching adults. Merry told officers he'd been on the floor looking for his earpiece and then became aroused. I suppose earpieces do that to some people, don't they? At the time of the offences, Merry was the subject of a community order for outraging public decency, and he was arrested for committing a sex act while under a computer desk at a college campus in Nottingham. The court heard Merry had been assessed by a psychosexual therapist who described him as being truthful about having a foot fetish. His defence lawyer said that Merry committed the offence due to his foot fetish and not because he was sexually attracted to children. The lawyer said, "It's not children, it's feet." That's small comfort, isn't it, for the kids and their parents?
You know, the problem for me in these cases is that when does an abnormal sexual desire become a danger to the public? These people they've become addicted to their irrational and abnormal sexual desires. A bit like a drug addiction, I suppose. Drugs exaggerate the emotions and senses of an individual. And many people use drugs but manage to stay within the parameters of acceptable behaviour. It's those that are unable to manage their habit that become a danger to themselves or others. How much should these fetishes be accepted? And by that acceptance actually supported and encouraged maybe? The police only get to see things when they go tragically wrong, when a person's behaviour moves on to crime. The Wakefield case shows how a person's abnormal sexual urges can lead to murder. In the Wakefield case, detectives were unable to identify Farrow as a person of interest. Why was this so difficult? Why did no one suggest his name? Would it be easier now? Would Farrow be identifiable from other sources of information, such as social media?
Well, there is a popular website called Meetup, which allows people to meet up for all kind of social or professional reasons. Quick check of the website shows that it has over 90,000 people signed up for fetish groups and over 100 actual fetish groups. So people are generally quite open about their fetish and do like to meet like-minded individuals. And I guess there's nothing illegal about that, is there? There's also some discussion in the academic world about fetishes. In the magazine Psychology Today, an article considered fetishes, and here's part of it. The discussion in question concerned whether or not it is possible to eradicate a fetish. Most respondents were in agreement that, as with a sexual orientation, eradicating a sexual fetish is not only impossible, but particularly in fetishes that cause no harm, can even be unethical. The British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy also reported on, and I quote again, "My clinical observation is that fetishism usually presents in males and has typically begun by adolescence. Yet despite this, there is limited literature and much misunderstanding. One paper declares that a boy was unable to admit his interest and behaviour was unacceptable and shameful. I find this phrase shameful in itself," says the author. They go on, "It's also worth noting that psychiatrists had the option of defining homosexuality as a mental disorder up until 1986. By this reckoning, it will be a long time before sexual fetishes are accepted as lifestyle choices rather than, quote, unacceptable and shameful, close quotes, sexual perversions."
Okay, we can see from those articles that this area is a minefield in itself, even for the psychotherapists. Fetishes have always been prevalent in human society, regardless of the culture and type of society. And this is true, I'm sure, in oppressive regimes as much as in liberal societies. But this lifestyle choice, it's an interesting term. I just hope that in a more open society, before people like Christopher Farrow go on to murder, that they will be offered some help to control and manage their behaviour. I live in hope that these fetish groups will help people to stop their urges from going out of control. But as a former police officer and coming from a police perspective, I feel it's not so much how we can prevent these crimes, but how quickly we can identify those offenders when they occur. If the opinion of psychologists is divided, we've got a long way to go. I would say that if Christopher Farrow had committed this crime today, that he wouldn't have had to wait those 6 years for that 6 o'clock knock.
That is very reassuring, Jack, very reassuring indeed.
You know, going back to the definition you gave at the start, Simon, the word fetish deriving from the word for magic, and a time when people worshipped objects, the talisman. We've moved on from those days, surely, haven't we?
Well, you'd like to think so, but it depends on your talisman, doesn't it? We hope you enjoyed this episode of the 6 o'clock knock. Oh, and don't forget to keep in touch by following us on social media. We'd love to hear your feedback. So until next time, from me, Simon Ford, Jack Morell and our super producer Paul Bradshaw, it's goodbye.
The 6 o'clock knock is presented by Simon Ford and Jack Morell and produced by Paul Bradshaw and is available on every major listening app. Please help us spread the word by giving us a 5-star review and telling your friends to subscribe.